When you think of a samurai, you probably see a guy in heavy armor swinging a sword on a battlefield. But that's mostly a movie myth. For a long time, Japan was actually at peace. So instead of fighting wars, these legendary warriors were stuck filing paperwork and falling into deep debt. It was a weird time. I want to show you 3 things that prove just how strange it really got. First, some samurai actually had to make paper umbrellas just to pay their rent. Second, since they couldn't fight real people anymore, they tested their swords on dead bodies. And third, the government had strict laws on exactly how they had to shave their heads. I'm just a guy who loves reading these stories, so subscribe if you want to stay for the next one. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Let's get into the story. So, it's 1603. Before this, Japan was basically one giant mess of people killing each other for a couple hundred years. It was constant. But then, this guy named Tokugawa Ieyasu finally wins the big fight. He becomes the Shogun. That's basically the guy in charge of everything. And he has one goal: stop the bleeding. He wants the fighting to end, and he wants it to stay ended. To do that, he did something pretty extreme. He closed the doors. He told the rest of the world to stay out, and told everyone in Japan they couldn't leave. Then he looked at all those dangerous warlords, the guys who had been leading armies and trying to kill him for decades, and he gave them an order they couldn't refuse. He told them they had to move to a new city called Edo. We know it today as Tokyo, but back then it was just a swampy village that he was turning into a massive capital. He didn't just tell the warlords to move. He made them bring their families and their entire staff. And here was the real kicker. They had to spend every other year living in Edo, right under the shogun's nose. When they eventually went back home to their own lands, they had to leave their wives and kids behind in Edo as hostages. It was a brilliant, mean move. If you're a warlord and you're thinking about starting a fight, you're going to think twice if the shogun is holding your family. Plus, moving hundreds of people back and forth across the country every year is incredibly expensive. These guys spent all their money on travel and housing instead of buying guns and horses for a war. So the fighting stopped, but that created a huge problem. You had thousands and thousands of samurai just hanging around with nothing to do. Think about who these guys were. They were trained from the time they could walk to be professional killers. Their whole identity was built on how well they could use a sword or a bow. They lived for the battlefield. That was their only skill. And suddenly, there were no more battlefields. The war was over. The borders were closed, and everyone was supposed to just get along. This is where the reality of the situation really started to sink in. The government didn't need guys to charge into battle anymore. They needed people to keep track of how much rice was being grown. They needed people to write down laws, manage budgets, and make sure the roads were being paved. They needed a giant office staff to keep the country running. So the shogun told the samurai they had to change. He didn't take away their swords. They were still allowed to carry those as a sign of their social status, but he told them they had to put away the armor. Imagine these tough guys who used to spend their days training in heavy metal gear. Now they're putting on these fancy stiff silk robes. They're sitting on floor mats in big wooden buildings, and instead of a spear, they're holding a brush and some ink. The samurai became the world's most dangerous middle managers. Their new enemy wasn't a rival clan, it was a mountain of paperwork. If you wanted to get ahead in this new world, you didn't need to be the best at sword fighting. You needed to be the best at math. You needed to have good handwriting. You needed to know how to talk to people and navigate a bureaucracy without losing your temper. The whole country turned into a giant machine of rules and records. Every village had to report exactly how much they produced. Every penny spent by the government had to be tracked. The warriors who used to dream of a glorious death on the field were now spending their afternoons worried about missing a deadline or making a mistake in a tax report. They were sitting in offices, drinking tea, and waiting for the day to end. It was a complete flip of their entire world. They went from being the most feared men in the country to being the guys who made sure the mail got delivered on time and the taxes were collected correctly. It wasn't exactly the heroic life they had imagined when they were kids, but it was the only job left in a country that had finally decided it was done with war. They had to trade their shields for ledgers, and their lives would never be the same. So you've got these guys who spent their whole lives learning how to take a head off with a single swing. They've traded their armor for silk robes and their spears for writing brushes. But just because the war was over didn't mean the hierarchy went away. In fact, the government doubled down on it. They set up a social ladder that was basically impossible to climb. It was called the Shi-no-Koko system, and it was the law of the land for over 200 years. Think of it like a 4-story building. On the very top floor, you had the samurai. They were the only ones allowed to carry swords. They didn't have to pay taxes, and they were the only people allowed to hold government jobs. If you were a samurai, you were a big deal. You held the life and death of everyone else in your hands. If a commoner was rude to you on the street, the law literally said you could cut them down right there. But here's the weird part. On the second floor, right below the warriors, weren't the rich people or the priests. It was the farmers. Now, being a farmer sucked. You worked from dawn to dusk in the mud, and you barely got to keep any of what you grew. But on paper, you were a hero. The government told everyone that farmers were the backbone of the country because they produced the food. Without them, the whole system would starve. So they got the number 2 spot as a kind of thank you for your service, even if they were usually broke and exhausted. These were the artisans and the craftsmen, the guys making the bowls, the silk, the houses, and the swords. They were respected because they actually made things. They took raw materials and turned them into something useful. And then, at the very bottom of the pile, on the ground floor, were the merchants. In our world today, we treat successful business people like rock stars. But in 17th century Japan, they were seen as parasites. The idea was that they didn't actually create anything. They just moved things from point A to point B and took a cut of the profit. They were seen as greedy and dishonest. Even if a merchant was a millionaire, he still had to bow to a penniless samurai who didn't have a dime to his name. But this is where the math starts to get really ugly for our warrior friends. See, the government didn't pay samurai in gold coins or paper money. They paid them in rice. 1 koku was about 5 bushels of rice, which was supposed to be enough to feed one grown man for a whole year. If you were a big shot lord, you might get 1,000,000 koku. If you were just a regular beat cop samurai, you might get 30. This worked fine when everyone was living in small villages and trading eggs for carrots. But as the peace dragged on, Japan changed. Big cities like Edo and Osaka started booming. People wanted things. They wanted fine sake. They wanted to see plays at the theater, and they wanted fancy tea. And you can't exactly walk into a theater and hand the ticket guy a bowl of wet rice. You need cash. This is where the merchants, the guys at the bottom of the ladder, started to take over. They were the only ones who really understood how money worked. A samurai would show up with his heavy bags of grain, and he'd have to sell them to a merchant to get coins. But the merchants weren't stupid. They knew the samurai were desperate for cash to pay their bills, so they'd wait until the harvest was huge and the price of rice was low before they'd buy, or they'd charge massive fees for the exchange. Before long, the samurai were getting squeezed. They were the rulers, but they were watching the value of their paychecks drop every single year. It got even worse because the samurai were trapped by their own status. They had a massive list of rules they had to follow to prove they were still at the top. This wasn't just about pride, it was the law. A samurai had to live in a certain kind of house. He had to have a certain number of servants following him around just to go to the grocery store. He had to wear expensive silks and keep his equipment in tip-top shape. Imagine you're a guy making 50 grand a year, but the law says you have to drive a Ferrari and live in a mansion just to keep your job. You'd be broke in a month. That's exactly what happened to the samurai. They were living on a fixed income of rice, but their cost of living was exploding. So, what do you do when you're a noble warrior and you can't pay for your fancy silk robes? You go to the person you're supposed to despise. You go to the merchant. You ask for a loan. Pretty soon, almost every samurai in the country was deep in debt to the people they were supposed to be looking down on. You'd have a samurai walking down the street, looking all tough with his 2 swords, and he'd have to cross the road just to avoid the merchant he owed money to. The social ladder was still standing, but the foundation was rotting away. The guys at the top were becoming servants to the guys at the bottom, all because they couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap between a bag of rice and a gold coin. This wasn't just a budget problem. It was a slow-motion car crash that was about to turn the entire Japanese world upside down. So you're stuck in this slow-motion car crash. The economy is breaking, the money is weird, and the old way of life is dying. But you still have to get up on Monday morning. Think about a guy named Suzuki. He's a mid-level samurai, which sounds cool, right? You're thinking of a hero from a movie. But Suzuki doesn't feel like a hero. He feels like a guy who really needs another hour of sleep. His day starts before the sun is even up. He crawls out of bed, and the first thing he has to do is get dressed. This isn't as simple as throwing on a pair of jeans. For a samurai in this era, getting dressed is a legal minefield. The government actually has a giant list of rules about what you can wear. It's called a dress code, but with the threat of prison. He has to put on these wide, stiff trousers called hakama. Then he puts on a vest with huge, pointed shoulders that make him look like a human origami project. He has to check the fabric. Is it the right color for his rank? Is the pattern too flashy? If he wears something too nice, he's breaking the law for being too greedy. If he wears something too cheap, he's shaming his boss. Then he spends 20 minutes on his hair. He shaves the top of his head and waxes the rest into a stiff ponytail that he folds forward. If one hair is out of place, he looks like a slob, and in this world, looking like a slob is a career-ending move. Finally, he straps on his 2 swords. They're heavy. They've been in his family for generations. They're incredibly sharp and could kill a man in 1 second. But Suzuki hasn't actually used them in a fight, ever. Neither did his father. These swords are basically just a very dangerous, very expensive necktie. Now he leaves his house and starts the long walk to the local castle. This is his commute. But he can't just put in headphones and zone out. Walking down the street is a high-stakes game. There are strict rules about where you stand. If Suzuki sees someone coming toward him who has a higher rank, he has to move to the side. He has to know exactly who that person is from a distance. If he accidentally walks on the wrong side of the road or fails to move fast enough, he's in trouble. And then there's the bowing. I'm not talking about a polite nod. There are different levels of bows for different people. You have to know the exact angle. If he bows at a 30-degree angle to a guy who deserves a 45-degree angle, that guy might take it as a slap in the face. He could report Suzuki to his supervisor. Suzuki could lose his job. He could lose his house. His kids might not be able to eat because he didn't bend his back far enough at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. Imagine the stress of that. Every person you pass on the street is a potential lawsuit or a reason to get fired. He finally gets to the castle. Does he go to the dojo to practice sword fighting? No. He goes to a room that looks exactly like a modern office, minus the chairs. He sits on the floor at a low wooden desk. The room is filled with other men in the same stiff vests, all sitting in perfect silence. There is no water cooler talk. There is no joking around. Suzuki's job for the next 10 hours is to be a clerk. He spends his day grinding an inkstone to make black ink. He takes a brush and writes down numbers. He's tracking how much rice came in from the farms. He's checking the math on how much that rice is worth in gold coins. He's filling out forms in triplicate. If he makes a typo, he can't just use whiteout. He has to start the whole page over. If he makes too many mistakes, his boss will notice. And his boss is a guy who is also stressed out, also wearing a sword, and also looking for any reason to prove he's doing a good job by cracking down on his underlings. Maybe he's not a clerk. That sounds better, right? It's not. It means standing perfectly still for hours in front of a gate that is already locked. No one is coming to attack the castle. There hasn't been a war in 100 years. He's just standing there, his legs cramping, his back aching from the weight of the swords, watching a butterfly or a leaf. If he slumps, if he looks bored, if he closes his eyes for a second, he's failing his duty. This is the reality for the warrior class. They are elite soldiers who have nothing to fight. They are trained to die for honor, but they are spending their lives doing data entry and standing in hallways. It is a high-pressure, high-anxiety office job where the company handbook is 500 years of tradition, and one mistake can ruin your entire bloodline. Suzuki isn't worried about enemy spies or rival ninjas. He's worried about his boss's mood and his own math skills. He's a warrior by title, but a bureaucrat by trade. And as he sits there, cramping up on the floor, he knows he has to do it all again tomorrow. This was the new face of the samurai. The sword was still there, but the pen was the thing that actually ruled their lives. So that pen, it was a lifeline, but it couldn't fix the math. Here's the thing about being a samurai in the 1700s. You did not get a bank deposit every 2 weeks. You got bags of rice. That was your salary. For a long time, that worked out great. But then the economy did what economies do. It broke. Suddenly, there was too much rice on the market. When there is too much of something, the price falls through the floor. Your garage full of rice was suddenly worth half what it was last month. But your rent, your taxes, The price of tea and clothes, those stayed exactly where they were. These guys were elite warriors, and they were going broke in real time. Think about the math for a second. To turn that rice into actual spending money, you had to go to a broker. These brokers were merchants. Imagine a guy who has no noble blood and no right to carry a weapon, but he holds every single card. The samurai would bring his rice to the broker's shop. The broker would look at the market prices, take a big cut for himself, and hand over a pile of coins. The samurai hated this. They felt cheated. They felt insulted. But they had no choice. They were warriors trapped in a system that did not need warriors anymore. They were trapped in a system that only cared about the price of a grain of rice in a warehouse 50 miles away. Now, you would think they could just go out and get a second job. Most people would, but they couldn't. It was literally against the law for a samurai to be a merchant or a laborer. It was considered dirty. They were supposed to be above common work. If you were caught selling fish or fixing shoes in the street, you could lose your status. You would be a total disgrace. So they were stuck. They had the status, they had the swords, but their stomachs were growling. They had to get creative, and they had to do it in the dark. Picture this. A guy spends all day at the office doing paperwork for the government. He walks home looking sharp. He has his 2 swords tucked into his belt. People bow to him as he passes. He looks like a killer. But as soon as he gets inside his house and locks his gate, the swords come off. He does not go to sleep. He rolls up his sleeves and starts gluing paper onto bamboo frames. He's making umbrellas. Not for fun, not as a hobby. He's doing it because if he does not finish 20 of them by sunrise, his kids do not eat. These were not just a few guys doing this. It was almost everyone. Your backyard was not a peaceful garden anymore. It was a farm. Samurai were out there in the mud, growing radishes and eggplants. They would wait until nightfall, put on a disguise, usually a big straw hat to hide their face, and sneak into town. They would sell their crops to the very merchants they were supposed to look down on. It was a total role reversal. The guy with the swords was begging the guy with the money to buy a bunch of carrots. Then you had the bird cage makers. It was a huge trend back then to keep crickets or small birds. Making those cages took a lot of skill and very steady hands. It turns out that if you were trained to use a sword with precision, you were actually pretty good at making tiny wooden cages. So you have these high-ranking soldiers sitting on their floor mats for hours. They are hunched over, tying tiny knots and sanding down little bits of wood. It was quiet, desperate work. They would sell these items through a middleman. Usually it was a merchant who knew exactly who was making the goods, but had the sense to keep his mouth shut. It was a weird, unspoken deal. The merchant got high-quality stuff to sell, and the samurai got to keep his family alive without the neighbors finding out he was basically a factory worker. Some of them even started secret schools. If you were good at math or writing, you might open a tiny classroom in your house. Again, you could not advertise. You could not put a sign out front. You just had to hope people heard through the grapevine that you were willing to teach their kids for a few extra coins. It was a shadow economy. Every samurai neighborhood looked peaceful and dignified on the outside, but if you could peel back the roofs, you would see a frantic hive of activity. You would see men who were meant for war, doing the most boring, repetitive tasks imaginable just to stay afloat. They were trading their dignity for a bag of charcoal or a new pair of sandals. The gap between their public life and their private life was massive. Out on the street, they had to act like the toughest guys in the room. They had to maintain that warrior spirit. They would walk with their heads high and their shoulders back. They looked like they could cut you in half if you looked at them wrong. But their hands were covered in glue and ink. Their backs were sore from bending over umbrellas instead of training with bows. They were living a lie every single day. They were pretending to be the protectors of the land, but in reality, they were just trying to figure out how to pay the guy who sold them miso paste. The swords were becoming decorations. The real fight was not on a battlefield with an army. It was at a small wooden table in a dark room, trying to finish one last umbrella before the sun came up. It was a slow, quiet change, but it was changing the very meaning of what it meant to be a samurai. They weren't fighting for honor anymore. They were fighting for rent. So you've got these guys who were built for war, now worrying about the monthly bill. It's a weird spot to be in. Imagine your great-grandfather was a legendary war hero, and now you're looking at your bank account and seeing nothing but zeros. That was the reality for a lot of samurai in the city. They were still walking around with 2 swords tucked into their belts, but their pockets were completely empty. To understand how this happened, you have to look at how the whole country was set up. Back then, the government had a strict social ladder. At the top were the samurai. Below them were the farmers, then the craftsmen, and at the very bottom were the merchants. The idea was that if you just moved money around or sold stuff other people made, you weren't really contributing much to society. But as the peace dragged on, that ladder started to lean the wrong way. The problem started with how the samurai got paid. They didn't get a paycheck with a dollar amount on it. They got paid in rice. Every year, their boss would give them a certain number of big straw bags filled with grain. Now, you can't exactly walk into a shop and hand over a handful of rice for a new pair of sandals. I mean, you could, but it's a huge pain. So the samurai had to take their rice to the city and trade it for actual coins. This is where the merchants come in. They were the ones who ran the warehouses and the exchange shops. They were the middlemen, and if there's one thing middlemen are good at, it's making sure they get a cut of the deal. The merchants were smart. They watched the market. When the harvest was good and there was plenty of rice, the price dropped. The samurai would show up with their bags, and the merchant would tell them their rice wasn't worth much that day. But the samurai still had to pay for their houses, their clothes, and their food. They had no choice. They had to take whatever the merchant offered. Before long, the warriors were losing money just to get paid. It didn't take long for the debt to start piling up. Think about your most prized possession. For a samurai, it was his armor and his swords. These weren't just tools. They were the symbols of who he was. They were family heirlooms passed down through generations. But when your kids are hungry and the landlord is knocking on the door, you stop caring about your family tree. Samurai started doing the unthinkable. They'd wrap their armor in a cloth, wait until it was dark so their neighbors wouldn't see, and head down to the local pawn shop. They were trading their grandfather's battle-worn helmet for enough cash to buy groceries for the week. It got so bad that some samurai were walking around with wooden swords painted to look like steel, just so they didn't look like they had given up. They were literally faking it until they made it, except most of them never made it. While the samurai were getting poorer, the merchants were getting rich, like really rich. They were building massive houses and buying the best silk. But they had a problem, too. No matter how much money they had, they were still at the bottom of the social ladder. They couldn't carry swords, and they had to bow to any samurai who walked past. So they started using their cash to buy respect. They'd find a samurai who was drowning in debt and make him a deal. The merchant would pay off all the samurai's loans if the samurai adopted the merchant's son. Just like that, the merchant's kid becomes a samurai. Or a rich merchant would marry his daughter off to a broke warrior. The merchant got the status he wanted, and the samurai got to keep his house. This turned the whole city into a theater of fake smiles and hidden ledgers. It created this massive social awkwardness that you could feel in the streets. Imagine you're a samurai. You're walking down a narrow alley, and you see the guy you owe 3 years' salary to. In the old days, you could have just ignored him or even gotten angry, but now you can't. If you're too mean, he might call in your debt and take your house. If you're too nice, you look weak in front of your peers. You end up having to be polite to the person you were taught to look down on. The warriors were still wearing the gear, but the shopkeepers were the ones holding the leash. The merchants even started to dress better than the warriors. The government tried to pass laws to stop this. They told the merchants they couldn't wear certain colors or expensive fabrics. But the merchants just got creative. They'd wear a plain, boring coat on the outside, but line the inside with the most expensive gold silk they could find. It was a private joke. They knew they had the power. They knew that the tough guys with the swords were actually working for them. The rigid class system wasn't just cracking. It was basically a pile of dust. The people at the bottom had become the bankers for the people at the top. And in a world where money talks, the warriors were losing their voice. They were still samurai by name, but they were becoming something else entirely. They were becoming a class of people who were just trying to survive a system that didn't need soldiers anymore. They were warriors in a world run by shopkeepers. So, these guys are walking around in a world that doesn't want them to fight anymore. They've got the status, they've got the history, and they've definitely got the weapons. But that leads us to one of the most famous and totally misunderstood laws in history. It was called Kirisute Gomen. It sounds like the ultimate tough guy move. On paper, the law said that if a commoner, a farmer, a shopkeeper, or a craftsman, did something disrespectful to a samurai, the samurai could kill them on the spot. No trial, no waiting, just a quick swing of the sword, and then you walk away. It sounds like the kind of power that would make you the king of the street. But in reality, Kirisute Gomen was a giant, terrifying trap for the samurai. It was a law that sounded like it gave you power, but it actually took your life and put it through a meat grinder. Here is how it actually worked. Let's say you're a samurai walking through a crowded market in Edo. You're wearing your family crest, you're proud. Then, some guy selling fish accidentally bumps your shoulder and doesn't apologize. Or maybe a drunk carpenter laughs at your frayed sleeves. In the old days, that would be a fight. Now, it's a legal right. You can end his life for that. You have the ultimate power of life and death. But here's the catch. The second that body hits the dirt, your life is basically over for a very long time. You couldn't just kill someone and go grab lunch. The law was very clear about what happened next. You had to go straight to the nearest government office and report yourself. You had to tell them exactly what happened, and then the system took over. You were immediately put under house arrest. You weren't allowed to leave your home. You couldn't go see your friends. You just had to sit there and wait while the government poked around in your business. And they didn't just take your word for it because you had a sword. They would go back to that market. They would find every single person who saw what happened. They would interview the other fish sellers. They would interview the guy's neighbors. They would dig into your past and his past. And this is where it got really dangerous for the samurai. Not just kind of annoying or a bit clumsy. He had to have done something so bad that it made it impossible for you to keep your dignity. If the witnesses said, Well, he just tripped and splashed some water. He didn't mean it. You were in deep trouble. If the magistrate decided the killing wasn't 100% justified, you were charged with murder. And for a samurai, the punishment for murder wasn't just a fine or a few years in a jail cell. It was death. You would be ordered to take your own life, or you'd be executed like a common criminal. Your family would lose their house, your kids would be out on the street, all because some guy bumped into you at the market. It gets even more complicated. There were these specific rules about how you had to do the killing. If you tried to kill the guy and you only wounded him, and he managed to hit you back, or if he picked up a rock and defended himself, you were done. The law looked at that and said it was just a fair fight between two guys. And because a samurai is supposed to be a professional warrior, losing a fight to a guy who sells tofu was a massive disgrace. Even if you survived the fight, the government would fire you. They would take away your rank. They would take away your salary. You would become a ronin, a masterless samurai, which basically meant you were homeless and unemployed. So put yourself in the samurai's shoes. You're looking at this shopkeeper who is being a jerk to you, but then you're thinking about the 3 months of house arrest. You're thinking about the detectives talking to your neighbors. You're thinking about the chance that a witness might lie or just forget the details. You're thinking about the possibility of having to cut your own stomach open because the guy you killed was actually just a bit clumsy and you overreacted. You can guess what happened. These legendary warriors started becoming the world's best at ignoring insults. They became experts at looking the other way. If a commoner started talking trash or acting up, the samurai would suddenly find a very interesting cloud to look at. They'd duck into a tea shop. They'd walk twice as fast to get away. There are actual stories of samurai literally picking up their robes and sprinting down an alleyway just to avoid a confrontation with a drunk guy. They weren't running because they were scared of the guy. They were running because they were scared of the paperwork. The commoners weren't stupid either. They knew the samurai were terrified of the legal trouble. So some of these guys would push it. They would be just rude enough to be annoying, but not quite rude enough to justify a killing. It was a weird, tense game of chicken. The samurai had a loaded gun, but the trigger was tied to a bomb that would blow them up too. You'd have groups of young guys in the city who would intentionally get in a samurai's way just to see him squirm. They knew the samurai couldn't do anything without risking his entire life and his family's future. Think about how that feels. You've got these 2 swords on your hip that are supposed to be your soul. They are the symbols of your power. But in this new world of rules and red tape, those swords were just heavy pieces of metal that could ruin your life if you actually used them. The ultimate power of the samurai had become a massive liability. It was a badge of rank that you prayed you never had to justify. These warriors weren't just becoming accountants in the office. They were becoming accountants of their own actions on the street. They were constantly weighing the cost of their honor against the cost of a funeral. And most of the time, they decided that their honor wasn't worth the mountain of forms they would have to fill out. The warriors were still there, but they were being strangled by the very system that was supposed to protect them. They were held hostage by their own privilege. The law that was meant to keep them on top was actually the thing keeping them in line. They were warriors in name, but they were living in a world where a pen was a lot more dangerous than a sword. If the pen was more dangerous than the sword, then even the way a samurai died had to be written down in a rulebook. You see, back in the warring days, seppuku was a pretty straightforward thing. You lost a battle, you didn't want to get captured, so you took your own life right there in the dirt. It was messy, it was fast, and it was personal. But once the peace started and the government took over every part of life, even killing yourself became a massive corporate event. It wasn't just about honor anymore. It was about paperwork, procedure, and making sure you didn't make a scene. Imagine you're a samurai in the middle of this peaceful era. You messed up. Maybe you insulted the wrong guy, or you handled some tax money poorly. Whatever it was, the government decides you have to go. But they don't just send a guy to your house to chop your head off. That would be too simple. Instead, they hand you a schedule. The whole thing turned into a giant, expensive theater production. First, you couldn't just do it in your backyard. The government had to approve the location. Usually, it was in a garden or a specific courtyard of a palace. They would bring in carpenters to build a special stage. They'd cover the ground with thick straw mats and then cover those mats with white cloth. White was the color of death. If you were the guy in the middle of this, you had to wear a very specific outfit. It was a white robe called a shiro mozoku. No patterns, no family crests, just plain white. And you weren't alone, far from it. This wasn't a private moment. You had a whole crowd of people watching you. There were official witnesses sent by the government to make sure you followed the rules. There were assistants to help you move. There were even people there just to check that the mats were straight. It was like a wedding, but way worse. Before the main event, you had to sit down and have a final meal. They'd bring out your favorite foods, but let's be honest, you probably weren't very hungry. After you ate, you had to write a poem. This was a big deal. You had to sum up your entire life in a few short lines. If your poem was bad, people would talk about it for years. Talk about pressure. Once the poem was done, you'd sit on your heels in the middle of that white stage. This is where your second comes in. This guy was called the kaishakunin. Usually he was a friend or a really skilled swordsman. His job was to stand behind you with a long sword. His goal was to cut your head off the second you showed any sign of pain. But there was a catch. He wasn't supposed to cut the head all the way off. He had to leave a tiny sliver of skin connected at the throat, so the head would fall forward and hang there, rather than rolling around on the floor and spraying blood on the witnesses. It was all about keeping things clean and polite. But as the years went on, the government realized that not every samurai was a hardened killer. Some of these guys were just middle-aged accountants who had never seen a real sword fight in their lives. The idea of them actually sticking a knife in their own stomach was a nightmare for everyone involved. What if they screamed? What if they fell over sideways? What if they missed? It would ruin the dignity of the whole ceremony. It would make the government look bad. They called it the fan seppuku. This is where the whole thing truly becomes a weird bureaucratic dance. Instead of giving the samurai a real sharp knife on a tray, the officials would bring out a wooden tray with a folded paper fan on it. Think about how strange that is. You're sitting there in your white robes. The crowd is watching. The guy with the sword is standing behind you, and you reach out for a paper fan. You didn't actually have to cut yourself. You just had to make the motion. The second your fingers touched the paper, the guy behind you would swing his sword and end it. It was a total sham, but everyone pretended it was real. They wrote it down in the official records as a traditional seppuku. They told the family that the samurai died with courage. Why did they do this? Because it was easier. It kept the carpets clean. It made sure the ceremony stayed on schedule. It turned a violent, terrifying act into a box that just needed to be checked off. This tells you everything you need to know about the samurai in peacetime. They were so wrapped up in rules and appearances that even their most famous tradition became a fake gesture. They weren't warriors anymore. They were actors playing the part of warriors. They had to follow the script, wear the right clothes, and reach for the fan at the exact right second. If you did everything by the book, there was a reward. Your family got to keep your house and your money. The government would let your son take over your job. But if you messed up the ritual, if you cried out or didn't sit straight, they could take everything away. Your family would be broke and homeless. So these men sat there and reached for a paper fan, not because they wanted to, but because it was the final piece of paperwork they had to finish. They died the same way they lived, following a set of instructions written by a guy in an office who cared more about the rules than the person. Death wasn't the end of the job, it was just the last item on the to-do list. So, you've got your to-do list, you've got your boss, you've got your paycheck. But what happens when the boss loses his job? In 17th century Japan, if your lord got fired or died without an heir, you didn't just go to a headhunter or update your resume. You were finished. You became a ronin. That word literally means wave man. It sounds poetic, like you're some free spirit drifting on the ocean. But the reality was a lot more like being a homeless veteran with absolutely no social safety net. Movies love these guys. They show them as these cool, mysterious heroes who show up in a dusty town, kill the bad guys, and ride off into the sunset. You've seen the posters, the lone wolf with the cool hair and the sharp sword. But movies lie. Being a ronin sucked. It was miserable. Imagine you spent your whole life training to be an elite soldier. You can't farm because you don't know how. You can't start a business because the law says samurai aren't allowed to be merchants. You're stuck. You're a professional killer in a world that doesn't want any more killing. When a lord lost his land, hundreds, sometimes thousands of samurai hit the road at the same time. This happened way more often than you'd think. If a lord didn't follow the government's rules, or if he just didn't have a son to take over when he died, the government would just take his land away. In an instant, every single person who worked for him was out on the street. They didn't just lose their jobs, they lost their houses. The places they lived were company housing. When the lord left, the samurai and their families had to pack their bags and get out. So now you have these guys wandering the countryside. They were broke, they were hungry, and they were still carrying two very sharp swords. They would walk from village to village looking for anything to do. Some of them tried to keep their dignity. They would find an old shed or a barn and try to teach the local kids how to fight. But the local farmers didn't have much money to spare. They'd pay these master warriors in scraps of food or a corner to sleep in. It was a huge step down. You went from being at the top of the social ladder to begging for a bowl of watery soup or a handful of radishes. You were a nobleman who now had holes in his shoes and a stomach that wouldn't stop growling. But not everyone tried to stay honest. If you're hungry enough and you have a weapon, you start looking for easier ways to get a meal. A lot of ronin turned into thugs. They joined up with local gangs or started their own. They'd show up at a marketplace and tell the shopkeepers that it would be a real shame if their store burned down. They'd run protection rackets. They'd bully travelers on the road. They were basically the original version of organized crime. Because they were trained to fight from the time they could walk, the local village police couldn't really handle them. It was like having a group of special forces veterans decide to become bank robbers. There wasn't much a regular guy with a wooden staff could do against a guy who spent 20 years mastering the art of the draw cut. This made the government in the capital absolutely terrified. Think about it from their perspective. They spent decades trying to bring peace to Japan. They finally got everyone to put their swords away and start filing paperwork. And now They had thousands of angry, unemployed men with nothing to lose wandering around. These weren't just random people. These were guys who knew how to plan an ambush, how to lead a squad, and how to take over a fortified building. The government saw Ronin as a ticking bomb. Every time a new group of Ronin appeared, the officials in the capital got a massive headache. They didn't see them as heroes. They saw them as a massive security threat that could ruin everything they had built. They were a glitch in the system that the government couldn't figure out how to fix. The rulers wanted a world where everyone stayed in their lane. Farmers farm, merchants sell, samurai serve their lords. But a Ronin didn't have a lane. He was a warrior without a war and a servant without a master. He was an outlier. And in a society built on strict rules and staying in your place, an outlier is the most dangerous thing you can be. It got so bad that the government started passing laws just to try and control them. They tried to ban them from entering the big cities. They tried to force them back into farming by taking away their swords. But you can't just tell a guy who thinks he's a nobleman to go pick rice in the mud. It just made them angrier. They started gathering in tea houses and back alleys, whispering about the good old days when there was plenty of work for a man who knew how to fight. They weren't just looking for food anymore. They were looking for a way back into the life they lost. And they were willing to do some pretty dark things to get it. You're a samurai. You've got the outfit, the haircut, and the social status. But you have never been in a real fight in your entire life. Neither has your father. Neither has your grandfather. You're carrying around this weapon that is supposed to be your soul, but for all you know, it's just an expensive piece of jewelry. If you ever actually had to use it, would it work? Or would it snap the first time it hit a bone? That's the question that kept these guys up at night. Since there weren't any wars to provide a testing ground, the samurai had to get creative. And by creative, I mean they got incredibly dark. They started a system called Tameshigiri. Basically, it was professional sword testing. But you can't just swing a sword at a wooden post. Wood is too hard, and it doesn't feel like a person. You need something that has the same density and resistance as a human body. And since they weren't about to volunteer themselves, they used the next best thing, the people the government was already planning to kill. When a criminal was sentenced to death, they didn't always just get their head chopped off, and that was it. Often, their bodies were handed over to the sword testers. These weren't usually the samurai owners themselves doing the cutting. It was a specialized job, mostly handled by a family called the Yamada. They were the masters of this. They were essentially professional executioners who moonlighted as quality control for the rich. They knew exactly where to cut to see what a blade was made of. They would take the body to a specific sand pit. They'd pile up some dirt to make a mound and lay the body on top. Then the tester would take the new sword and give it a full power swing. They had a whole list of specific cuts they used to grade the blade. Some were easy, like going through the arm or the neck, but the real test was the torso. They wanted to see if the blade could make it all the way through the thickest part of the spine and the ribs without stopping or chipping. Now, here's where it gets really wild. If a sword was really good, one body wasn't enough of a challenge, so they started stacking them. They'd pile 2, 3, or even 4 bodies on top of each other. They'd tie them together so they wouldn't move. Then the tester would step up, take a deep breath, and try to cleave through the whole pile in one single motion. I'm not talking about a messy hack. I'm talking about a clean, smooth slice that goes out the other side and hits the sand. If the sword made it through, it got a rating. But they didn't just write it on a piece of paper. They wanted the proof to stay with the sword forever. They would take the handle off the sword to get to the metal tang underneath, which is the part of the blade that hides inside the grip. Then they would use a chisel to carve the results right into the steel. You can still see these today in museums. Some even have the name of the guy who did the testing and the date he did it. It was like a performance rating for a sports car, but for killing. This wasn't cheap. If you wanted your sword tested on a body, you had to pay for it. You had to pay the executioner, and you often had to pay a fee to get access to the bodies. But for a samurai who was worried about his reputation, it was worth every penny. The weirdest part is that most of these swords never actually saw a real battle after the test. They'd get the 3-body rating, the owner would show it off to his friends at dinner, and then it would sit on a rack for the next 50 years. It was all about maintaining the fantasy. They lived in a world of peace, but they were obsessed with the mechanics of death. They needed to know that if the world ever fell apart again, they were ready. This wasn't just some clinical experiment. It was a gruesome, bloody business. Sometimes the bodies were still warm when they did it. It shows you just how much the samurai missed their old lives. They were so desperate to feel like warriors again that they turned a morgue into a laboratory. They were trying to keep the spirit of the war alive by hacking apart the people who couldn't fight back. It was a strange mix of high-end craftsmanship and total brutality. But as the years of peace dragged on, even these sword tests started to feel like a performance. The samurai were becoming more and more detached from the reality of what their weapons were actually for. And as they spent more money on these certified blades, they were running out of the one thing they actually needed to survive in this new world: cold, hard cash. So there they were, standing around with these museum-quality weapons and empty pockets. And that's when the real world decided to show up and kick the door down. In 1853, these 4 massive ships appeared off the coast, right near the capital. We called them the Black Ships because they were coated in dark tar and they were spitting out thick black coal smoke. To the people on the shore, they looked like something out of a nightmare. They were steam-powered, made of iron, and they had huge cannons that could reach for miles. I want you to picture the samurai in this moment. They'd spent centuries telling everyone they were the ultimate protectors of the country. So they did what they were trained to do. They hopped into their little wooden rowboats and headed toward the ships. They were wearing their best armor and carrying those incredibly expensive swords we talked about. They probably thought they looked terrifying. They shouted their names and their family histories across the water, expecting a formal challenge. But the Americans on those ships didn't care about family history. They didn't even care about the swords. They just looked down from those giant iron walls and basically told the samurai to get lost. The message was clear. Your old ways don't work anymore. Those blades that cost a fortune, they were useless against a steam engine and a long-range cannon. You can't slice a cannonball in half. The samurai realized right then that they had been bringing knives to a gunfight for a long, long time. This wasn't just a blow to their pride, it broke the whole country. For over 200 years, the Shogun, the big military boss, had kept everyone in line by promising he could keep the world out. Now he looked weak. He looked like he'd been caught sleeping. People lost faith in the government almost overnight. Fights broke out in the streets. civil war started brewing. In the end, the Shogun's government just couldn't hold it together anymore, and it totally collapsed. This is where things got really wild. A new group of young, ambitious leaders took over. They brought the emperor out of the shadows and put him back on the throne. We call this the Meiji Restoration, but it was really just a massive, high-speed upgrade of the whole country. These new leaders looked at the West and realized that if Japan didn't change, and change fast, it was going to be conquered. So they started cutting the old stuff out like a surgeon. The first thing to go was the idea of the samurai as a special fighting class. The government decided they needed a modern army. They didn't want guys who spent 20 years learning how to swing a katana. They wanted guys who could learn how to fire a rifle in a few weeks. To do that, they did something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. They started a draft. They took the guys who used to grow rice, the peasants, and put guns in their hands. Think about how that felt for a samurai. For centuries, only you and your buddies were allowed to carry weapons. Now, the guy who used to bow to you in the street was standing next to you with a rifle that could kill you from 100 yards away. You weren't special anymore. You were just a guy in the way of progress. Then, in the 1870s, the government finished the job. They officially abolished the samurai class. They told them they weren't warriors anymore. They were just citizens. They even told them they had to cut off those top knots. You know, the traditional hairstyle that shouted, "I'm a warrior," to everyone who saw it. It was like forcing them to cut off a piece of their soul. But the real gut punch was the sword law. The government passed a rule that said samurai weren't allowed to carry their blades in public anymore. If you walked outside with your swords, you were a criminal. Imagine that! Your whole identity, your family pride, and everything your ancestors stood for was tied to those two pieces of steel on your hip. And just like that, you had to leave them at home on a shelf. The party was officially over. The world didn't need warriors anymore. It needed people who could work in factories and sit in offices. The era of the sword was dead, and the modern world had arrived. So, the party was over. The sword was gone. Now, I want you to imagine you're one of these guys. You've spent your whole life training to be a professional fighter, and suddenly the government tells you your job doesn't exist anymore. Not only that, but they tell you that you can't even wear your swords in public. It was a total mess. You're essentially a dinosaur watching the asteroid hit the ground in real time. Your pension is cut off, your social status is trashed, and even your haircut is considered out of style. Naturally, some of these guys didn't take it well. They had this massive identity crisis. You had groups of former samurai who gathered in the hills, fueled by pride and a lot of anger. They picked up their old blades for one last stand against the new world. You've probably seen the movies about this, but the reality was much grimmer. They went up against a modern army equipped with guns, cannons, and steamships. You can't stop a bullet with a piece of steel, no matter how sharp it is. These rebellions were crushed, and most of those fighters died in the dirt trying to hold on to a world that had already moved on. It was a dead end. But here's the part people usually miss. For every rebel who died in a field, there were 1,000 more who just sighed, brushed off their new suits, and went to work. These guys were smart. They realized that if they wanted to survive, they had to adapt. And they had a massive advantage over everyone else. They weren't just fighters. They were literate, they were organized, and they were used to following a strict chain of command. They looked at the new Japan, and they saw a lot of open job slots. A lot of them became the country's first modern police officers. It makes sense, right? If you need someone to keep order and handle a weapon, you hire the guys who did it for a living for centuries. Others went into politics. They traded their kimonos for three-piece suits and started building a new government from the ground up. They used their old leadership skills to run cities instead of fiefdoms. Then you had the ones who jumped into the world of business. Take a guy named Iwasaki Yatarao. He came from a low-ranking samurai family that had actually sold off its status just to survive. He didn't sit around moping about the good old days. He started a shipping company. He used the same discipline and focus he learned as a warrior to crush his competition. That company eventually became Mitsubishi. Yeah, the same Mitsubishi that makes cars and electronics today. He didn't build that empire by being soft. He treated his company like a clan, and he expected his employees to act like his soldiers. This is where the story really connects to the world you see today. The samurai actually didn't disappear. They just changed their outfits. All those old rules they had about loyalty, hard work, and putting the group before yourself, they didn't throw those out. They just moved them into the office. When you look at a modern Japanese company, you're looking at the ghost of the samurai era. The long hours, the intense loyalty to the boss, the idea that your job is your entire identity, that is all leftover warrior stuff. They traded the sword for a briefcase, but the mindset stayed exactly the same. They stopped fighting wars with blades and started fighting them with spreadsheets and manufacturing lines. That's the real legacy. The samurai didn't go extinct. They just got promoted to the boardroom. The warrior didn't die. He just learned how to balance a checkbook and conquered the global economy instead.